Welcome into the Football Guys Fantasy Football Show. I'm Alfredo Brown, joined as always by Dave Kluge. Today, we are taking a look at our top 48 plus wide receivers. That's right, Dave. We're at the point where we can overpromise, over-deliver. We're over. We're over, and everyone's over us.
I'm kind of over the offseason. I'm ready for football, man.
We're over the preseason. We're ready to get this started. Let's jump into our wide receiver rankings right here with the wide receiver one tier. At number one, CeeDee Lamb, Tyreek Hill at 2, at 3, Jamar Chase, at 4, Amon-Ra St.Brown, at 5, Justin Jefferson, 6, AJ Brown, 7, Puka Nacua, 8, Garrett Wilson, 9, Deebo Samuel, 10, Nico Collins, 11, Drake London, and 12, Jaylen Waddle. So, Dave, there's some names there that people are probably going to be surprised that aren't on that list, and we will obviously get to them. But what I want to focus on here is the positives, right? The players that could just absolutely outproduce their ADP or even their current ranking. Last season, Amon-Ra St.Brown was being drafted at the end of round 2 as the wide receiver 10. He ended up finishing as the wide receiver 4 in points per game. There's got to be a guy in this group that could do something similar. Do you have a favorite wide receiver out of this group that you like to target that's maybe not going in the first round?
As I so often like to do, you're going to ask me for one player, and I'm going to give you 2. But Nico Collins and Jaylen Waddle are both primary targets for me at the top of round 2. And I talked about that in my, just did this manifesto where I kind of say this is how you should draft based on the drafts that I've done this offseason. And I feel like the entirety of round 2 is kind of flat when you're looking at wide receivers. And so many people want to adhere to ADP, but I feel like the guys that are getting drafted at the end of round 2, I almost prefer to the guys going at the top of round 2, where a lot of people are paying up for Garrett Wilson and Deebo Samuel and Drake London. I prefer to take Nico Collins and Jaylen Waddle in that spot. You look last year, Nico Collins was 2nd in the league in yards per route run, 5th in the league in EPA. This is a guy that we've known has been really talented for the last few years, and he's just been hamstrung by awful quarterback play. We finally see him with a good quarterback, and all of these peripheral metrics that got us so excited through his first 2 years come to fruition into great fantasy production. Now, I think the concern here is obviously what it'll look like with Stefon Diggs, but I think the addition of Stefon Diggs can be offset by the expected year 2 jump that we're hopefully getting from CJ Stroud. So Nico Collins is a primary target for me at the 1-2 turn, and then the other guy that I mentioned is Jaylen Waddle. Talked about him a lot this offseason. A guy who in his rookie year was an elite target earner, top 5 in the league in targets per route run. In year 2, Tyreek Hill shows up into the picture. The usage falls off a cliff, but then he leads the league in yards per route run and is just an efficiency monster. In year 2, the usage and the efficiency were both there, but injuries kept his production at bay. So Jaylen Waddle is a guy right now that's falling in the kind of the 2-3 turn, but I'm okay paying up for him with an early 2nd round pick. And I did 2 drafts yesterday. One of them was in our Football Guys Bowl draft, and another one was in a super flex. We're doing this Reddit versus Twitter draft. That was a super flex draft, and I took Jaylen Waddle in round 3. In our Football Guys Bowl draft, I took Jaylen Waddle in round 2. He's a guy that I think should be priced near the 1-2 turn and just keeps falling in drafts and is one of my favorite targets.
One of the guys that I look at here, and I'm actually changing my ranking mid-show here because we've been doing the research, and just like every time you keep peeling back this layer a little bit more, and a guy you talked about was Deebo Samuel, that if Brandon Aiyuk is traded, all of a sudden you're looking at him as probably being the top 8 wide receiver, maybe even better, like we don't know. But even with Brandon Aiyuk on the roster last year, Dave, from week 10 on, this was after the bye week for San Francisco, Deebo Samuel was the wide receiver 2 in fantasy football, wide receiver 3 in points per game. And that's PPR. For all the people that say Deebo doesn't get the volume he needs, doesn't get the targets that he needs, he's a gimmicky guy, he's got to be healthy, this and that. We've seen Deebo Samuel play plenty. He doesn't really miss a whole lot of time, but when you kind of know, right? Like, what's the rule again with Deebo? If he practices, you play him. Well, can you refresh us on that rule?
Yeah, Adam, it was a hunch that I had. So I talked to a man who is smarter than I, and I said, Adam, I've got this feeling that when Deebo Samuel is limited in practice leading up to game day, he just doesn't play as well as he normally does. And Adam disappeared for a couple of hours and came back and said, Dave, your hunch is correct. In weeks that Deebo Samuel is limited in practice leading up to kickoff, his production drops by almost 30% going into that game. So it's Deebo Samuel. They'll put him out there if he's not 100% and use him in this kind of decoy role at times. But when he's healthy, when he's a full participant in practice, he is one of the best wide receivers in fantasy football. So I've got him lumped in that same tier. And that, for me, it's Nico Collins, Jaylen Waddle, and Deebo Samuel are all kind of in this tier together. But looking at all of those guys as early second round picks that I'm happy to draft.
Yeah, you know what? I'm doing it as we speak here, Dave. I'm moving Garrett Wilson to 9,
There you
Deebo
go.
Samuel to 8.
Yep.
We're doing it. Drake London, you're moving down. I'm going to put you at 12. Nico, you're at 11. What's up, everybody?
And I think
We're
one
just
of the
moving
big
because we're
concerns
doing
with
live.
Garrett Wilson, like, we know he's a really good player, but as we talked about a couple of weeks ago when we were in Canton, the buzz from a lot of people who are plugged in right now. Now, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but there are so many rumors that Davante Adams wants out of Vegas. And if he
Yeah.
leaves Vegas, he's almost assured to land with the Jets. And Garrett Wilson's a great player, but we know how Aaron Rodgers operates. If he's got Davante Adams and Garrett Wilson on the field, Davante Adams is going to be his preferred target. So that's the fear with Garrett Wilson. He's a first round pick. And I think that if he is going to be the wide receiver one for 17 weeks with Aaron Rodgers, he could pay off that ADP. But there is risk that he could potentially end up being his team's wide receiver too at some point this season.
Do you fear? Because I kind of have the same fear with both Garrett Wilson and Drake London. Are we just drafting them at their ceilings? Because I don't know that either of these guys are jumping into the top 4 or top 5. Are we just picking them at their ceilings because we assume that's where they're going to be? It feels like once we get to that tier of wide receivers, we're just going after these guys that are the de facto next man up, and we're ignoring the Deebo Samuels, the Nico Collins, the guys who have done it, or even some of the players in our very next tier.
And that's why if I'm picking at the end of round one, where I'm picking 10th, 11th, or 12th, and then I'm following that up with the 13th, 14th, or 15th pick, I usually like to mix in one running back there with Jahmyr Gibbs, Saquon Barkley, Jonathan Taylor, often falling into the end of the first round. I like to draft one of those guys because there are a lot of question marks with these guys that are going, the wide receivers here, Drake London and Garrett Wilson specifically. You could say that any wide receiver getting drafted in the first 2 rounds is getting drafted near his ceiling.
Right.
But Drake London does concern me a little bit, just that we saw the fall off in usage after his rookie season. Rookie season, he had elite usage, and that's what we got so excited about. And then year 2, Kyle Pitts is back in the fold, and that usage fell off of a cliff. So even if the passing pie in Atlanta does grow a bit, there's going to be more targets to be spread around. I don't know if he's going to be pulling that 33% target share from his rookie season that got us so excited. Darnell Mooney is also in the mix, and I know you're going to laugh at that, Alfredo, but he is going to get his. He's going to end up
Oh, I
with
mean, he
somewhere between
exists.
80 and 100 targets. It's going to happen. So I don't think I think Drake London. I've made this joke a few times. Like when Drake London or when Kirk Cousins was traded to the Atlanta Falcons, I said, this is awesome. Drake London is going to be my favorite round 3 pick this year. And then he got pushed all the way up into the top of round 2, and it's just really hard to click the draft button at that price.
Yeah. Yeah, I get it. I really do. I think that there's such a weird fine line between projecting and ranking, and you talk about this all the time, especially these accuracy contests where really it's projections, and like a single injury can change everything about how accurate you are. When really ranking, sometimes you're ranking their floors, their ceilings,
Mhm.
their likely outcomes, not just simply the projections. So I like that you give us that nuance, that context there, Dave. Last
So,
season,
what else?
yeah,
Real
yeah,
quickly, the kind of actionable advice. What I'm trying to do, if I'm picking, because we've talked about it, the top 9, you're guaranteed one of the top 3 running backs: Chris McCaffrey, Bijan Robinson, or Brees Hall, or you're getting
right.
one of these elite wide receivers. Like at worst, you're getting Amon-Ra St. Brown, AJ Brown, or Justin Jefferson. Once you're picking at 10, 11, 12, then it gets shaky because then you're saying, do I want to take a risk on Puka Nacua or Garrett Wilson or Drake London? And I think the best thing to do if you're picking at the end of round 1 is to just pair up either Nico Collins, Jaylen Waddle, or Deebo Samuel, the 3 guys that we talked about in that tier that we really like, and try to pair one of those receivers up with Jahmyr Gibbs, Saquon Barkley, or Jonathan Taylor. I think if you can walk out of the 1-2 turn with one of those running backs and one of those receivers, you're probably feeling pretty good about your team build. And then it gives you a little bit more flexibility to target different positions later in rounds.
Yeah, and we're gonna go a little bit deeper into that and kind of what the wide receiver value and depth looks like down the board. Before we do that, though, I want to ask you this. Last year, we saw 2 of the 6 first round wide receivers in average draft position finish outside of the top 12. They weren't a total bust, but guys like Stefon Diggs, and Davante Adams did not finish as high as they were getting drafted. So in the top 6 right now, it's CeeDee Lamb, Tyreek Hill, Jamar Chase, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Justin Jefferson, AJ Brown. If there was one guy out of that 6, or maybe there's nobody, but is there a player there who you think could actually finish outside of the top 12 in fantasy points per game?
No, I really
Okay.
don't think so. I think that this is a pretty safe tier. But if there are two guys that I'd feel the least confident about, Tyreek Hill is getting up there in age. I'm sure you saw he picked up an injury recently. Doesn't seem super serious, but Tyreek Hill, he's the guy that I could see maybe approaching the age cliff. I don't think he's going to fall off of it, but we could potentially see a little trend downward, especially now with Jaylen Waddle on that long-term contract. We talked about his health kind of being his inhibitor last year. So if he's healthy this year, that could potentially cut into Tyreek Hill's role a little bit. But the upside is so high with Tyreek Hill that I'm not saying to fade him. It just wouldn't surprise me all that much if he finishes as, the wide receiver 10, wide receiver 15. And then the other guy is Justin Jefferson, who I know it's foolish to bet against the guy who is arguably the best wide receiver in the NFL, but the downgrade from Kirk Cousins to Sam Darnold could be a little bit more impactful than we realize. He's got some stiff target competition there as well with Jordan Addison and TJ Hawkinson. So I'm not saying to fade any of these players by any means. I'm still drafting them where they're going. They are top 9 picks for me soundly, but those are the two out of the top 6 that stand out to me as potentially having slippery floors.
Very smart of you. Avoid getting people angry in the comments. I like it. I mean, because we do want to talk about the players to target, but sometimes we have to bring up these players that you might want to avoid in the early rounds. And at least as of right now, it looks like that's not any of the top 6. Now, before we move on to our next tier, the wide receiver 2 tier, I want to remind you guys we got a bunch of ways for you to enjoy this show here on YouTube at youtube.com/at Football Guys Fantasy. If you're watching, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, all the fun YouTube stuff. That's the trio. And then on the audio version, we've got Apple and Spotify, all of the major podcast platforms so you can listen. After you listen to this episode, please take just 10 seconds, leave a review, tell us what you like, what you didn't like, maybe some topics you'd like to see, and we will be sure to take those into consideration going forward. All right, Dave, let's get to our wide receiver 2 tier where we're looking at wide receivers 13 through 24. At 13, we've got Marvin Harrison Jr., the rookie out of Arizona. 14, Chris Olave. 15, Mike Evans. 16, Cooper Kupp. 17, Brandon Aiyuk. 18, Davante Adams. 19, DK Metcalf. 20, DJ Moore. 21, Michael Pittman Jr. 22, DeVonta Smith. 23, T. Higgins. And 24, Amari Cooper. Now, Dave, when I look at this group, I'm reminded that last year, 3 wide receivers being drafted from the wide receiver 13 to 24 range ended up finishing as top 10 wide receivers in fantasy points per game. That means that there are players from this range that are going to surprise us and be, I know you said it's hard for them to be huge values at where they're getting drafted, but they could really outproduce their average draft position. So which wide receiver or receivers do you think have the best potential to do that from this group in 2024?
Cooper Kupp easily is the one that jumps out to me. I mean, this is the guy that we saw average 25 points per game over a 2-year stretch. Last year, he was slowed down by injuries, but when Puka Nacua was on the field, he was still garnering the same target share that we had seen in years past. It just seemed like the injuries caught up to him a little bit, and there were a few plays where he uncharacteristically couldn't get on the same page as Matthew Stafford. But Cooper Kupp is a guy right now that you can potentially draft as your wide receiver 3. Like I see him falling into the 3rd round, and then still has the same upside that he had last year. There's a lot of smart guys out there who do injury analysis. Edwin Porras, for instance, works with fantasy points, and he has just been pounding the table for Cooper Kupp, saying that like you could still draft this guy. Last year's injuries were just a fluke, and Edwin was one of the main reasons that I was all in on drafting Brees Hall last year. He's done some great work over the years, so I'm going to defer to the professionals in this scenario. Professionals tell me to draft Cooper Kupp. I am okay drafting Cooper Kupp. Another guy that jumps out to me though as having a high ceiling here is Brandon Aiyuk, and it's kind of weird. I've been drafting all offseason, and right after the NFL draft, Brandon Aiyuk was getting drafted 13th or 14th overall. Like he was going at the top of round 2. People were regularly taking him at the 1-2 turn. And then these rumors started to swirl that he was going to end up in Pittsburgh. He fell all the way to the middle to back end of round 3. And even though it seems like those rumors are now not as hot as they were a few weeks ago. It sounds like he's going to be staying in San Francisco. His ADP hasn't rebounded, and he's still going in the middle of round 3. But Brandon Aiyuk, we saw last year, was a top 10 wide receiver on a points per game basis. It's not going to be consistent, and it's not going to be pretty. He's going to have boom weeks. He's going to have some quiet weeks. That's just the nature of any of these playmakers here in San Francisco. But he is such a good wide receiver that I want to draft him knowing the efficiency is going to be sky high in San Francisco. And if he does end up getting traded, knowing that, well, the efficiency might take a slight dip, he is going to see a boost in usage. So I think that Brandon Aiyuk is just a good enough player that wherever he is, whether it's in San Francisco or Pittsburgh or New England or Carolina or whatever it may be, I'm just willing to bet on the talent here. And Brandon Aiyuk is one of the most talented wide receivers in the league.
Yeah, I mean, anyone on that 49ers offense, I'm willing to bet on just because the offense is going to be really good. The players are talented, and we've seen that they can all work together. This is not one thing where one guy eats and the other one doesn't. All of these players, I mean, the rising tide lifts all ships over there, and we haven't really seen that there's anyone coming in, even as much as I love Ricky Pearsall, like there's not really anyone coming in that's going to be taking action away from these guys. Now, if I had to pick someone who I think could actually really surprise us, I know you and I differ a bit on this player, but Chris Olave is a guy that I continue to look at because of the volume that he is seeing. Last year, Chris Olave, 138 targets that put him in the top 10 in targets. And then when we go and look at Chris Olave from week 9 on through the end of the season, he was tied for wide receiver 12 in points per game with Puka Nacua. So if there's a guy who I believe could jump from where I have him ranked as wide receiver 10. You have him ranked as wide receiver 17. He averages out to be our wide receiver 14 here. He's being drafted as the wide receiver 12. If there's a guy that, if touchdown variance goes his way, I could see him jumping into maybe that top 8, top 10. It's Chris Olave for me, just because there's so much volume there. And he's one of the few guys that's in this upper tier who was already getting a lot of volume. And then now more volume has opened up for him with Michael Thomas not being there. So that's a guy that I really like for this season. Dave, there's another player on here that both of us really like, and it's T. Higgins. Based on our rankings, T. Higgins in this tier is our favorite draft value. We've got him ranked at 22 and 24 respectively. That makes him our wide receiver 23 consensus. He, however, in average draft position is going as the wide receiver 28. So we're going about 5 spots higher on T. Higgins. What do you love about T. Higgins this season? What's the expectation from him?
I mean, he's a prototypical wide receiver one. When you look at his size, his speed, his contested catch ability, he is such a good complement to Jamar Chase. And I think this is just one of those recency bias things. Like everybody remembers drafting T. Higgins last year, plugging him in your lineup as the wide receiver too. And I forget if it was 8 or 11 targets, whatever it was. Like the opportunity was there week 1, and he got 0 points. And people don't forget that. Like that distaste was in the mouth of every fantasy manager for the entire year with T. Higgins. And then we've had multiple times over the years where he is not 100% and he's active and he's watching from the sidelines, or he goes out and puts up a dud in your lineup. And it's been a rough couple of years for T. Higgins. I'll be the first to admit it, but now we've got Joe Burrow back and healthy. Reports are that T. Higgins is fired up playing on a contract year, that he has just been dominating camp so far in Cincinnati. They just did joint practices with the Bears last week and said that T. Higgins was uncoverable. I mean, he's just a good young wide receiver, and this is probably going to be his last year in Cincinnati. We know that the contract disputes have been a headache that have lingered for over a year now. I don't want to put too much in the contract year narrative, but it does impact his play a little bit. But at the end of the day, T. Higgins is just a good wide receiver on a good offense. There's a lot of wide receiver 2s that are in this tier, and we're much higher on Jaylen Waddle than the consensus, but this is kind of this pocket of the draft in round 3 and 4 where you see T. Higgins, DeVonta Smith, Jaylen Waddle are typically being drafted. And we know enough now that these hyper funneled target trees that go to 2 or 3 players on an offense, especially a good offense, could still perform multiple top 10 wide receivers. I don't know if T. Higgins is going to be a top 10 guy, but the ceiling is certainly there that I'm okay reaching for him a round or half a round early.
Yeah, and we've seen that in the past. I mean, just in previous years, T. Higgins is the wide receiver 17, T. Higgins is the wide receiver 22, and now he's just getting drafted so much later than that because of, like you said, that recency bias, Dave. We've seen that there is a ceiling for him, a pretty good ceiling. Last year, in his final 6 games, he was a top 9 wide receiver in 3 of those final 6. It was an up and down season. Like, nobody's going to argue that, but not just for T. Higgins. for the Bengals in general. And by the way, those games where he was a top 9 wide receiver, a bunch of those were with Jake Browning at quarterback. This wasn't even with Joe Burrow. So we know what the ceiling can be for this Bengals offense. We don't know what the running game is going to be like. They could be leaning into that passing attack with T. Higgins and Jamar Chase more than ever this year with Joe Mixon off the roster. There is no Tyler Boyd. There's kind of an uncertainty at the wide receiver 3, or is that going to be Mike Gesicki out on the field, who has never really been a guy who's going to take targets away from top tier wide receivers. So T. Higgins, I'm confused as to why he's still being drafted so late. I think too many people are looking at last year, the injuries and what happened with the Bengals, but Cincinnati could just be ready to explode this season.
I also want to say
Dave,
DJ Moore.
Yeah.
I've got to mention my boy DJ Moore. Of course.
I'm gonna go take a bathroom break while you do this. Go for it.
I just want to say, the consensus has caught up. You and I were both way ahead of consensus on DJ Moore for the majority of the offseason. Now, all it took was like 2 Caleb Williams preseason highlights for everyone to be like, oh yeah, DJ Moore is the wide receiver 1 on this team and Caleb Williams might be good. We were ahead of the curve here, but people are starting to kind of catch up now. But we got to remember DJ Moore last year with, don't get me wrong, I like Justin Fields, but not the best quarterback play, still went for over 1,400 yards and gave us a great fantasy season. Now he's expected to have better quarterback play. This is a guy last year who pulled a 29% target share, ran a route on 100% of the team snaps. Like, he is going to be heavily involved. And as much as you and I have talked about Rome Odunze, liking him as a good mid-round target, DJ Moore is still a guy who is being drafted as a back-end wide receiver too, that it wouldn't surprise anybody if he finishes as a top 10 wide receiver this year.
Yeah, I mean, you can't look at a talented wide receiver who's earning targets, making explosive plays, getting touchdowns, and now you give him a better quarterback and say, he's probably not likely going to be top 10. I think that the likelihood of him being top 10 is maybe not as high as it's been in the past, but it's still there. That's something we absolutely have to keep in consideration. I think that one of the big detractors for him initially was not just Rome Odunze, but the addition of Keenan Allen and us saying, okay, how is this ball going to get dispersed to 3 wide receivers and a pass catching running back? And they now have 2 tight ends. What's going on here? The early reports on Keenan Allen have not been good. And the video has not been good. And Dave, you were talking about it in practice. He's not winning the one-on-one reps. There was actually a report yesterday. He had a good practice. Yeah, 3 touchdowns. Yeah, but it was in a red zone drill.
Right.
So it's you're not really having to beat anyone in a lot of space there.
Rome Odunze has been dominating the red zone drills so far. I'll continue to pound the table for it once we get a little bit later into the show. We'll kind of talk about where I have Rome and where I have Keenan Allen. But regardless of where they are, DJ Moore's still the wide receiver 1 here.
Oh, we're both high on Rome. We are both high on Rome. Call us Willie Nelson. Let's go to wide receiver 3 tier. At 25, we got Tank Dell. 26, Rashee Rice. 27, Stefon Diggs. 28, George Pickens. 29, Zay Flowers. 30, Diontae Johnson. 31, Malik Nabers. 32, Chris Godwin. 33, Christian Kirk. 34, Terry McLaurin. 35, Rome Odunze. And 36, Xavier Worthy.
We're making some stances in this round. Wow.
Dave, this is what the kids call standing on business. I've never used that in a sentence, but I'm glad I could today.
I wish you hadn't.
So in this tier, there are 3 wide receivers that were a lot higher on than the consensus. Rashee Rice, who's being drafted in round 6. Diontae Johnson, who's being drafted in round 7. And then our baby boy, Rome Odunze, who's being drafted in round 8. Out of these 3 wide receivers, and based on their average draft position, who is your favorite draft value from these 3? Rice, Diontae, and Rome.
I'm trying to think of how to say 3 of them in the same way we say both of them.
Treefum.
I don't know. I
didn't like that. I didn't like that at all.
All right. Back to the drawing board. But I think Rashee Rice is a guy, he's inside my top 24. And I think this is another one where you and I are just ahead of the curve. And I think that by next week or 2 weeks, as people start drafting, we're going to see Rashee Rice creep into that top 24 in ADP. I can't say anything with certainty. I'm not going to sit here and say that I understand every little intricacy of the U.S. legal system, but Drew Davenport
Definitely not.
on our staff is a lawyer, and he knows these things pretty well, and his trial is not till December. Like, Rashee Rice is going to have a trial in December, which is most likely just gonna get pushed out even further. He's probably not getting suspended this year, is what this comes down to. Like, he might be suspended next year. He might avoid suspension completely, but the risk of him actually being suspended in 2024 is so slim. And that's what's causing this discount. Again, I've been drafting all offseason before the car accident, before the punching of a photographer and all these stories that got Rashee Rice in the news. He was getting drafted in round 2, and then his value plummeted because of the legal concerns and hasn't rebounded since. I'm still drafting Rashee Rice as a top 24 receiver. And if any of my league mates are concerned and they're going to let him slip, I am going to scoop up that value. This guy was unbelievable last year. Like, his usage over the second half of the season was up there with CeeDee Lamb and Tyreek Hill and Amon-Ra St.Brown. Like, he was drawing an elite target rate on the routes that he was running. And he's on the best offense in the league with the best quarterback in the league. And yeah, Marquise Brown is there now, and Rashee Rice, or I'm sorry, Marquise Brown and Xavier Worthy are there now. But as we've talked about, they're complementary players. Like, they are going to get deep downfield and just open up even more underneath stuff for Rashee Rice. So I can't help but feel like if he avoids suspension, he's going to end up being the steal of draft day.
If I'm going to compare two players here in our rankings, and this is jumping ahead just a little bit, but looking at the value of it, Dave, Jordan Addison and Jackson Smith-Njigba are also going in round 8, the same as Rome Odunze, and they are outside of our top 40 wide receivers. Jordan Addison's at 43, Jackson Smith-Njigba is at 45 collectively. Rome Odunze at wide receiver 35, going in the same exact value as them. And by the way, that's just because we kind of have to put him there, being, one of 3 receivers on this team with a rookie quarterback in a new offense. But there is not enough that we can say about how talented of a player Rome Odunze is. And what sucks about a rookie is, like, there's not a way for us to say, well, based on this stat and this data point with Caleb, like, because we don't have that. This
Right.
is one of those kind of tough moments where we have to just look at a player on the field and say he's incredibly talented. He's really good at where he is. He's forcing his way onto the field. And by the way, in these 2 wide receiver sets, it's very likely going to be Rome Odunze who's going to be the guy that's going to have to beat people deep. Dave, I know you've been doing a lot of the looks at the Bears training camp here. Rome Odunze out on the field. What have been the biggest reports coming out of camp for him?
Well, first of all, Keenan Allen does still have the role in 2 wide receiver sets.
Okay.
So if we're looking at
How
preseason
long does
usage
that
right
last?
now, exactly. And that's what I'm getting at is I think right now, this is a guy we're comparing. What is Keenan Allen going in 8 year, 8 or 9? We're talking about a seasoned vet here. I
32 years
think,
old.
yeah, it's understandable that he's going to get some of these reps ahead of Rome Odunze, but you got to imagine, like, Keenan Allen's a 1 year rental. Like, they probably aren't extending him beyond this year. They're going to bring him in this year. They made the trade for Keenan Allen before the NFL draft, and I don't talk to Ryan Poles. I don't know what goes on inside his mind, but my guess is that if they knew Rome Odunze was going to be there at 9, they probably wouldn't have traded a pick for Keenan Allen. I think Keenan Allen was kind of, hey, this is going to be our wide receiver too, and then Rome Odunze surprisingly slid to them in the draft, and they were able to take Rome Odunze. So I think, just trying to kind of imagine, the Bears have done a really good job kind of having a big picture, long term view with how they're doing this rebuild and development here. Wouldn't you think that at some point in the season, they're going to say, hey, Keenan Allen's out of the picture after this year. Let's work on getting Caleb Williams and Rome Odunze, who are going to be tied together for the next 5+ years here in Chicago. Let's work on getting their chemistry right. I think we're going to see that happen. I'm not going to sit here and buy into the Keenan Allen fat at camp rumors. I think we hear stuff like that all the time. But at the end of the day, I just expect the young wide receiver who was drafted top 10 in his position, a guy that we have talked about through the entire draft process, that, like, if you look back at previous years' drafts, would be the wide receiver 1 in most draft classes, only fell because Marvin Harrison and Malik Nabers were in this draft class. He's just such a good wide receiver, and the reports out of Chicago are that it can't be ignored. Like, we're already seeing Caleb Williams and Rome Odunze making these magical plays in the preseason. They've been together the entire rookie process, through media day, through the combine, through the draft, all of this stuff. I think that we're just going to see that connection come to fruition on the NFL field. And I think that Keenan Allen is the guy who kind of falls by the wayside over the second half of the season. it's a big flag plant that I'm making, and I don't know if you're there with me. I'm not looking at your individual rankings, but I've moved Rome Odunze ahead of Keenan Allen, and um, the consensus isn't there yet. Maybe they will be by week one, but I was in a draft yesterday where Keenan Allen was on the board, and I drafted Rome Odunze instead of Keenan Allen.
David, I'm one spot higher than you on Roma Dunze. I've got him at wide
All
receiver
right,
35 with Keenan Allen at wide receiver 42.
there you go.
And a lot of this simply comes down to one, we know this Bears offense is going to be better than last year. And it's honestly, it's hard to like contain the excitement for Caleb Williams and the Bears offense, but you tweeted this the other day that Roma Dunze is closer to being the wide receiver 1 than he is the wide receiver 3 on that team. And of
Which is
course,
really just
no,
an obnoxious clickbaity way of saying that he's going to be
we
the wide
know,
receiver too.
we know, we know your tricks, Gypsy. But Roma Dunze, I think it's very easy to say at this point, he's the number 2 weapon on this offense, regardless of what sets he's in or what position he's playing. He's the number 2 weapon on this offense. And as a rookie, that's speaking volumes. And that chemistry with Caleb Williams, the fact that they're giving Roma Dunze end arounds in preseason and Caleb Williams is willing to target him deep on broken plays. Like there is something special there. There's often that intangible thing that you can't put into a data set. So
On
I'm
this list
I'm
of the
very
Bears
well.
weapons, where does Velus Jones fall for you?
73. Shut up. All right, let's go down to our wide receiver 4 tier where we get into number 37, Calvin Ridley, 38, Marquise Brown, 39, Keenan Allen, 40, Christian Watson, 41, DeAndre Hopkins, 42, Brian Thomas Jr., 43, Jordan Addison, 44, Jayden Reed, 45, Jackson Smith-Njigba, 46, Khalil Shakir, 47, Tyler Lockett, and 48, Cortland Sutton. Dave, I'm looking at some of these names here, and there are some like really standout wide receivers that I think have a lot of potential. Is the wide receiver position actually deep with value this season, or is this something we just sort of tell ourselves so that we can make the excuse to draft running backs and other positions early and then be like, oh, look, there are some wide receivers that I like here later in the 6th, 7th, 8th round? I know that's something that our friend Joey Wright said yesterday on our live draft that we did. If you haven't seen that, go back and check it out here on the channel. But Dave, when you look at these names, do you say, hey, there is some good wide receiver value here? Or would you rather just be drafting guys earlier?
Yeah, this is the weird tier where I really, really like some of these guys, and then there's others that I don't want anything to do with at all. So this is kind of a
Can I
weird
can I guess
tier.
that it's split between the old guys and young guys?
Oh, yeah, you'd guess right. I will say I don't hate DeAndre Hopkins at cost, but now with the injury, that has caused me to bump him down a little bit, and I don't like him quite as much as I used to. But yeah, some of the guys in this tier that I really like: Marquise Brown, Christian Watson, Brian Thomas Jr., Jackson Smith-Njigba, Khalil Shakir. Most of the young guys in this tier that I'm willing to bet on having a potential breakout this season.
Yeah, I'm noticing here that it's really split between just old guys, young guys, and that's kind of about it. There's really very few players that are in between. But we speak about these old guys: Keenan Allen, DeAndre Hopkins, Tyler Lockett. No disrespect to them, they are all 31 years old or older. That's normally not a good sign for the NFL. Do you think that any of these players will outperform where they're being drafted or even where we have them ranked? Each of these guys are all within the top 47 consensus for us. Or 48, really. I have him, Tyler Lockett's the lowest. I've got him at wide receiver 48. You've got him at wide receiver 46, actually ahead of his teammate, Jackson Smith-Njigba. So is there a guy between Lockett, Hopkins, Allen that you're saying, man, they could actually surprise a lot of people this year?
I think they could all outperform their ADP. But the question isn't outperforming their ADP. Like if I draft a guy as the wide receiver 42 and he finishes as the wide receiver 41, is that really what I wanted? Like, does the
Right.
wide receiver 41 have any sort of, um, that's just not somebody that's going to be valuable to your roster. And
Not a
again, I'm
needle
just
mover, right? It doesn't change things for your team. It's not winning you your week. You got what you paid for.
exactly. And this comes back down to the same conversation we had yesterday. A lot of these rankings kind of become a blend of rankings and projections because of Fantasy Pros expert consensus ranking contests. And that's where you have to slot some of these guys in. So, like, yeah, Keenan Allen's my wide receiver 38, but I probably don't want to draft him because he probably isn't going to give you a top 15 or a top 20 finish. Tyler Lockett, my wide receiver 46. Yeah, he's probably going to outperform that and finish as the wide receiver 38 to wide receiver 42, somewhere in that range. But that's not really why you're drafting guys in this area of the draft. Like when you're getting into round 7, 8, 9, you're swinging on upside. And like if everything breaks right for Marquise Brown and he does become that kind of skeleton key that could unlock this Chiefs offense, we could be potentially looking at a top 8 guy here. Like we've seen top 5 production over almost half a season when he was in Arizona with a healthy Kyler Murray. Like it's not out of the range of possibility that Marquise Brown could be a wide receiver 1. If Brian Thomas is really as good as we expect him to be and he takes over as the wide receiver 1 in Jacksonville, he could be a top 12 wide receiver. Jackson Smith-Njigba could take that big step forward in Seattle and, just vastly outperform his current ADP. So that's really what it comes down to is I'm swinging for the fences a little bit more here. And these younger guys that have a bit of the unknown in their range of outcomes have the higher ceilings. So yeah, like Calvin Ridley, DeAndre Hopkins, Cortland Sutton, these guys could probably outperform their ADP, but by how much? And it doesn't really matter if they're just outperforming their ADP by a couple of spots.
You mentioned some of these young guys, and these are the guys that I've been targeting in this tier. They have major upside, all being drafted in round 7 or later. Some of the guys specifically that I've been targeting, plenty: Christian Watson, Brian Thomas, Jackson Smith-Njigba, Khalil Shakir. There's another young guy that we can throw in here who has some upside, but it's I would say it's a little capped. That's Jordan Addison. Because of what's going on with the Vikings and Sam Darnold thing. We might see a tale of two halves for Addison, where he could get tons of volume with TJ Hawkinson out, and
Right.
then it could just decline. And that's something that you want to avoid in fantasy. It's as much as we say like you want to win your first few games, you also just you want to avoid the players that are going to have sort of that ceiling that's going to, it's just their ceiling sort of shrinks as the season goes on. So you want to avoid that. But when we look at those guys, Watson, Thomas, Addison, Reed, JSN, Shakir, these guys, which one of these ends up being your favorite mid-round target with the most upside? I know for me, it's probably going to be the two obvious ones that are closer to the top of this round, Christian Watson, or
Watson and
not round,
Thomas.
excuse me, tier. Yeah, Christian Watson and Brian Thomas, because these are the two big play threats. These are the guys who can do exactly what Calvin Ridley has done. And, what we see guys like George Pickens do, and a lot of, and T Higgins and Michael Pittman, DK Metcalf, they're in the same archetype as these big play wide receivers that can just make the explosive splashy plays and win you your weeks. And when you're drafting them this late, I tend to love the value there. So I know I've gone on long enough. Is there someone in this group that you like the most?
Yeah, I mean, just purely by rankings, those are the guys that I have highest. But let's throw value into the conversation a little
Mm.
bit. When you start looking at where these guys are getting drafted and the value that they could potentially present, Khalil Shakir is a guy that I don't throw around the term like must draft often, but Khalil Shakir, I'm trying to draft every opportunity I can, especially now with the injury to Curtis Samuel, a guy who, yeah, he knows Joe Brady's offense a little bit, but I talked about it. One of the reasons that I bumped Marquise Brown down in my rankings a little bit. Um, you know, uh, Anytime you've got a new player on a new offense missing out on preseason reps, that's impactful. And Curtis Samuel is missing out on very important reps with Josh Allen, where Khalil Shakir is the only receiver on this team that has a history with Josh Allen, and not just a history, like a prolific history, where last year he had the best quarterback rating in the league when targeting Curtis or Khalil Shakir. Khalil Shakir, you look at the fantasy points per opportunity, you look at the yards after catch per reception. Like there are so many metrics about Khalil Shakir that I get excited about. That he's a guy right now who is getting drafted in round 10, and I don't know how high his upside is. I'm not going to sit here and blow smoke and say that Khalil Shakir could be a top 10 guy. I don't think that's in his range of outcomes. But if he finishes inside the top 20 or the top 24 and you're drafting him in round 10, that's a fantastic value there. So I'm A-OK taking Khalil Shakir, who I expect to be the team's wide receiver 1.
Yeah, top 24 becomes very realistic for a guy who, like you said, team's wide receiver 1 and Curtis Samuel missing time. What I will say is this, is if you want to draft Khalil Shakir, do not wait till round 10 if you are
Yeah.
in a draft with Jeff Bell,
Yep.
because he took Khalil Shakir in round 8 and it pissed off everybody in the draft. And I honestly, with where he's at, I'm not waiting till round 10 anyways. I'd want to be trying to get him at round 9. And that's where we saw all three Bills wide receivers go in our Football Guys Bowl draft yesterday. Khalil Shakir went first, the 812, then Curtis Samuel at the 901, and then Keon Coleman at the 907. So all the Bills wide receivers went in that area, and that's where I'd be targeting Khalil Shakir, who, Dave, that's a great choice there. You and I have a little bit of a disagreement, though, on Jackson Smith-Njigba, wide receiver for the Seattle Seahawks. I have him as my wide receiver 36, which I'll admit, it's a little bit of projection. Thinking there's going to be a bit more of a breakout here. He's too talented for me to believe that he can't finish as a wide receiver 3. And I do believe that this is a player who's going to be getting more target volume and better high quality value targets down the field. But you've got him as your wide receiver 52 outside the top 48. That's behind players like Rashid Shaheed, Jacoby Myers, even his own teammate Tyler Lockett. What has you kind of souring on Jackson Smith-Njigba? Is that something where you're just kind of worried that maybe there's too many mouths to feed in that offense, or is this just you're worried about maybe the position he plays? What is it for you?
It's been a quiet camp for JSN, and I didn't think I realized how far down I had moved him, but I just keep kind of bumping him down because the biggest highlight that we've seen so far from anything Seattle Seahawks related was when they shared a one-handed catch that JSN made last year in the preseason. It's been a relatively quiet camp. Tyler Lockett's not going anywhere, and I think that maybe we could see that switch happen, but what we saw last year is that Tyler Lockett was still dominating on two wide receiver sets while JSN was watching from the sideline. And the kind of thing that I've talked about a lot with JSN early in the offseason that I talked myself into was that he was injured as a rookie. So I was kind of willing to just throw away his rookie season, knowing that he'll have a full camp this year to kind of get up to speed. But now it's his second year and a new offense that he has to learn. And it's just been kind of a relatively quiet offseason. We haven't heard a lot about JSN so far. So JSN and Lockett, where they're going, I know one of those guys is probably going to vastly outperform their ADP, but I don't have a strong take on one or the other. So at that point in the draft, I'm typically looking at other wide receivers that I have a little bit more conviction in. And JSN, I could totally be wrong on JSN. Super talented prospect. Loved him coming into the league, was buying the dip early in the offseason. But where a lot of other people are just moving him inside their top 40, inside their top 30, I just can't get there yet, and I'm just pumping the brakes a little bit.
I'm willing to be brave and tell you that you're wrong. And
I could
I'm
be.
gonna stand on my I'm just playing. I'm willing to stand on my soapbox for JSN. He's just too damn talented of a player. He's too good as a route runner. What we noticed last year was he just was not being used in the correct way. He wasn't getting any of those downfield targets. The offense
Mhm.
itself was just not very good. And you and I have talked about how this offense is going to change with Ryan Grubb. Going with a more of a vertical attack. And this is a guy who has been able to utilize players from inside the slot or even outside. And Rome Odunze, Jalen Polk, Jalen McMillan, all three of these wide receivers who are looking to contribute early as rookies were all in that Washington offense and all have run routes out of the slot. And it seems like this is an offensive coordinator that knows how to utilize valuable players from anywhere on the field. So that's what has me excited about Jackson Smith-Njigba. And, listen, if we're going to do we haven't gotten the highlights out of camp. My dog, I just opened up Twitter and I just typed in Jackson Smith-Njigba and I've got highlights left and right about how he was unguardable versus the Titans corners, who I get it, Titans secondary is
Eh,
not very good, but that basically he has been elite, quote, elite throughout camp and is poised for a wide receiver to jump, that the Titans cornerbacks could not guard him for the life of them at practice. There's hype every single which way for almost every single player in camp. Very rarely do we hear bad things. And I think when you do hear bad things, you actually do have to pay attention to that. It's the good stuff that you can kind of be like, okay, well, everyone's got good stuff. But Jackson Smith-Njigba is a guy who I think at his cost right now in the 8th round, there's little to no risk. And he becomes one of those players that could take a massive jump. Dave, we've gone through
I
our
just
top.
real quickly, I just
Yeah.
want to say, we do these training camp reports, and I'm
Hmm.
looking at the Seattle Seahawks bullet points, and from this week, the bullet point from Seattle is Jackson Smith-Njigba is building rapport with Geno Smith, but neither Tyler Lockett or DK Metcalf is going to go away. And I think that's the concern here, is that we just see,
No one
again,
expects him to
something
go away.
similar to what we saw last year, is that Tyler Lockett's on the field for two wide receiver sets. JSN is watching from the sideline, and if that's the case, JSN is just kind of a fancy Jayden Reed or Josh Downs.
Hmm. See, I think
And
we're making too much of I think we're making too much of the 2 and 3 wide receiver sets. So we start to look at that throughout the rankings. You've got the same reports about Tank Dell. You've got the same reports about Roma Dunze. Now we've got the same reports about Jackson Smith and Jigba. At some point, talent just wins over. Like we do have to admit that if we're going to be worried about 2 and 3 wide receiver sets or who's not going away or who's going to be there, we kind of have to do that for everyone. We got to be able to get a little bit more of a discount on these players. I think I do understand there's a little bit more projection with Jackson Smith and Jigba because we don't know what that offense is going to be like. Same thing can be said for the Bears. Same thing could be said for the Texans, which I know is kind of crazy to say with how good CJ Stroud has been, but now all the teams have a year's worth of film on him. So we can make these excuses for everyone. I'm still going to be a little bit higher on JSN. Now, we've gone through our top 48 wide receivers here, and obviously we didn't get to talk about everyone, but you can go and check out our rankings over on footballguys.com, and you can see all the reports, the training camp reports that Dave mentioned over on the website as well. But Dave, outside of the top 48, we've got some players who are in the very next tier, and we'll call this the wide receiver 5 tier that's going to be unlisted. So graphics department, don't worry. You don't have to fit that many faces onto one screen here, but there's guys like Ladd McConkey, Jamison Williams, Romeo Dobbs, Rashid Shaheed, Josh Downs, Jacoby Myers, Jerry Jeudy, Josh Palmer, Curtis Samuel, Jalen Polk, Mike Williams. All these guys are ranked from wide receivers 49 through 60. Is there one in this group that you look at and say, he's a sleeper wide receiver that I'm going to be targeting in drafts?
Ladd McConkey. Sorry, I got something in my throat here.
Got you choked up.
Ladd McConkey's the guy that I've got ranked highest of the bunch just because Justin Herbert's a good quarterback and somebody needs to catch the passes there. And I hate that narrative, but Ladd McConkey's a good player. And of course, the injury concerns could cause some people to bump him down a little bit. But I think that he is going to be the wide receiver 1 on this team. Conversely, as opposed to being higher on Ladd McConkey than most, I'm a little bit lower on Josh Palmer than most, a guy who we've seen with the opportunity over the years and just hasn't really been able to capitalize on it. I think Ladd McConkey's a guy who could just get open immediately off the line and be that open target for Justin Herbert, the same way that Keenan Allen has been in years past. So he's the guy that I'm highest on of the bunch. But value-wise, one of the guys that I like the most, and I talked about him recently when we did a show, is Brandon Cooks, who I think is just a great value right now. He is the clear-cut wide receiver 2 on the Dallas Cowboys. I expect him to out-target Jake Ferguson. Last year, he almost never came off the field, and he was able to give us some fantasy production based on touchdowns, but I think that rapport with Dak Prescott should grow a little bit into their second year together. Hopefully we see the target share go up a little bit, but he is just a savvy veteran who is going to be on the field a lot for a team that's going to score a lot of points and score a lot of touchdowns. And I don't know, I guess I'm just kind of recycling everything that I said about Ezekiel Elliott and why I like him. He's just a boring, unsexy veteran who's going to have a role on a good offense. So Brandon Cooks right now, getting drafted outside of the top 50 wide receivers on a lot of different platforms, I could easily see him finishing as a wide receiver 3 this year.
The guy for me, you mentioned Ladd McConkey, a rookie, but another guy for me who was drafted around the same spot in the NFL draft, Jalen Polk, wide receiver for the New England Patriots. And I think it's easy to sit here. He's a dog. He was a Husky. But it's easy to say, like, we're not into any of these Patriots players. And I totally respect someone for saying that. Like, I get it. You don't have to be in on the Patriots. However, we did this last year where we were not in on the Houston Texans because you've got a rookie quarterback and because you got a bunch of rookie wide receivers or unproven wide receivers. You had a defensive-minded head coach. You had a lot of stuff that you really just weren't sure about. And I think I said this earlier in the offseason, but I'll say it again. I'm not expecting the Patriots to be the Texans, but we also can't count out that can't happen here. Jalen Polk is incredibly talented. He's already earned a spot as a starter, whether it is in 2 receiver sets, 3 receiver sets, does not matter. As of right now, all the reports coming out of camp is that he is the top target earner for this team, regardless of who's at quarterback. But we've seen that the value for him, the production for him on field has gone up even more so when Drake May is on the field. And Dave, I know you've been watching preseason with Drake May out there. He looks great.
Ooh,
Jacoby Brissett, we know he's a good quarterback, but we also know he's a stopgap and he might be out there for 2, 3, 4 weeks. And sooner or later, this is going to be Drake May's team, which all that tells me is that not only does Jalen Polk have the good ceiling of getting targets early in his career and early in the season, but that the value of those targets could start to skyrocket if Drake May gets out there and the offense is looking better and better. And that's the kind of player that I want to roster, a player that is going to get better as the season goes on. Right now, you can draft him in the 14th round, which is just crazy. You're picking him up as like a wide receiver 8 for your team. It doesn't quite matter because of the value here. But Dave, you and I have him a bit higher. We have him here, like we said, in that wide receiver 5 range. I love Jalen Polk. I love all of the wide receivers coming in from the University of Washington this year. And I'm taking a look at it right now. Dave, yesterday in our Football Guys Bowl draft, Jalen Polk went in the 11th round. So 3 rounds higher than ADP. So Football Guys themselves really love Jalen Polk as
That draft
well.
room
So
was brutal, by the way. And I know you already mentioned it. You can find the
so rough.
stream on YouTube. Just watch Alfredo and I pulling our hair out, thinking we can get away with like kicking value down the boards, and just a room full of sharp analysts. Just we couldn't pull anything in that draft. I mean, it's drafting with some of the best. It was a frustrating draft to say the least.
I'm ready for that in the listener league too, by the way. Our
Oh,
listeners are sharp, and on top of that, they know exactly who we like and don't like, so they just always tend to ruin our draft plans. But yeah, I was tilting very, very hard during that draft yesterday.
I just want to say, in
Dave,
typical Dave fashion, I'm going to sneak in 2 more sleepers because
of
that's
course you
what I
are.
do.
Of course you are.
Romeo Dobbs, he's not going to come off the field. I know people are like enamored with Jayden Reed, and you and I are both a little bit below consensus on Jayden Reed. I think it's going to be the same thing we saw last year, that Jayden Reed is going to be a slot only player. Have you heard the talk coming out of Green Bay that like Jair Alexander said that Romeo Dobbs is the best wide receiver in
Yeah,
the league? I'm not buying into
yeah,
that, but
yeah.
he and Jordan love each other, man, and like he profiles to be that outside receiver there. Romeo Doubs isn't going to come off the field, and he is just one of my favorite targets late in drafts. And then the other guy that I'll shout out that you can get probably in round 16 of your draft right now, probably going undrafted in a lot of drafts because of the dreaded high ankle sprain. Josh Downs,
Yes.
a fantastic rookie season, and there's going to be a dip in production or in his ADP now because of the ankle sprain, but you might be able to pick him up. And if he's out, you could stash him on your IR spot for a few weeks. But Josh Downs is a guy who is just a very, very good receiver. I don't understand why his rookie season flew under the radar the way that it did, but looking right now, even despite the injury, like you and I are both still way above consensus. Right now, his consensus ranking is wide receiver 65. You and I both have him much, much higher than that. So Josh Downs is another guy right now who you can draft essentially for free at the end of your draft and does have some really, really nice upside.
I said this yesterday on our running back episode, but my favorite analysis of fantasy football players is when we can look at them and just say they're good at football.
Yeah.
Makes it really easy to draft them.
Don't make it harder
Well,
than
there
it
you
has
go.
to be.
Dave, we did it. 48 wide receivers plus what was that? Another 4 more. So we hit 52 wide receivers. I'm out here doing math. Look at that. Well, we did it. That's a lot of them. We're going to be continuing on with quarterbacks, tight ends. We're going to be finishing up rankings week here as we inch closer and closer to the NFL season. Fantasy football drafts are almost here. And to be prepared for that, make sure that you are not only subscribed to this channel, but Football Guys Dynasty channel, the Football Guys Audible channel, and the Football Guys newsletter, where you're going to get all the information you need, the daily news reports and breakdowns of everything happening in preseason and training camp sent directly to your email inbox by the man himself, Joe Bryant. As always, I want to thank you guys for watching. For myself, for Dave Kluge, we'll see you next time. Adios.